Morning, everyone. So we were partway through chapter 21, the spells and incantations. Here we go. Of the Dreamsnatcher, I should say, because I'm reading so many books. It could be anyone. The witch doctor nodded. Melanthus are rare flowers, not always pretty and known by most as standing for trickery, but they're loyal, always flowering at the same time every year. She looked at Moll. You know the flowers stood for trickery, didn't you? Moll nodded. Yet you still came, though your parents and your camp didn't believe me. That's something, trusting and hoping, despite what others say. It's a good sign, Molly. Moll mumbled. She wanted to tell them, the witch doctor, that it had been Griff who'd led them up to the hovel while she'd been thinking about spinning heads and rolling eyes. The old woman looked at the black flowers settling on the surface of the liquid. Some say a name chooses you, she whispered, and I came to be known after these black flowers. Melantha. Moll wasn't sure how to respond to this, so she clicked her tongue and focused on the mortar. Melantha reached towards a row of jars on the shelf. No, not bat spleens. Ooh, she muttered to herself, and not toad tongues this time. She lifted a jar of jellied eyeballs up. Perhaps not eel's eyes either. She picked up another jar. Yes, of course. Moll grimaced at the contents of the jar. A small, dead reptile floating in liquid. Melantha passed it to Alfie, who winced but unscrewed the lid nonetheless. We need the tail of a newt, she said, because newts are special creatures. Why? Alfie asked. Well, if they lose a limb, they can grow another, one of nature's miracles. Melantha sliced off the tail with a knife, and we need a miracle right now. Don't believe in miracles, Alfie mumbled. Yet you believe in magic, Melantha said quietly. And what I've seen of that isn't pretty. How can you live in a forest and not believe in the glittering magic of it all? Melantha whispered. Alfie looked to Moll for support, but she only shrugged. Haven't you heard the tree spirits whisper, and the wind had helped us escape the vapours? That's proper magic. The drums and chants and pits in the ground that Skull calls magic is just a rotten copy of the real stuff. She peered into the bowl. The liquid was a swirl of black, purple and yellow, like marbled dyes mixing together, and the ground-up egg and feather floated onto the surface. We're nearly there, Melantha said. She picked up the bones from the table and placed them in the bowl. They bobbed onto the surface of the multicoloured liquid, the words staring blankly up at them. Alfie and Moll watched for several seconds. Oh, nothing's happening, Alfie mumbled as Moll glowered at the bones. Wait, Melantha said. She picked up a rattle and closed her eyes, and then into silence. She shook the rattle again and again. Each thrust sounded like a gust of wind rushing through the trees. Moll's breath caught in her throat. The last rattle she'd heard had been the skull's death snatch. She swallowed. This was different, though, she told herself. It had to be. And then, very quietly, Melantha began to whisper, strange words under her breath. They seemed to start from the very back of her throat, deep and guttural, and then finish in a soft, swishing sound. Moll had never heard anything like it before. It wasn't like a dream snatch. It was different somehow, something to not be afraid of. Something extraordinary happened. The bones began to judder, as if brushed by an invisible wind, and almost so slowly that it seemed as if it wasn't happening, and they all started to break. Look, Moll whispered, clasping her mouth. As they watched, the bones broke into tiny pieces, each carrying a single letter from the original words. The letters bobbed onto the surface of the mixture until the bones no longer spelt Jew, Hill Maiden, but were a jumble of meaningless letters. Melantha struggled across to the window and nudged it open. She pushed her clawed hands through, bending them, twisting them, curling them into the night. Moll remembered her words. A witch doctor's hands are her tools. And suddenly Melantha's didn't look ugly anymore. They were almost beautiful, as though they shaped the incantation. A silken breeze floated through the window, and it seemed to come in a whisper of sparkling black dust, as if Melantha had called the very essence of the night itself into her hovel. And before their eyes the letters in the bowl began to move. They clicked each other, almost dancing on the surface of coloured swirls. Moll's eyes widened as she watched the letters rearrange themselves into 4 recognisable words. I am well hidden. No one said anything, and then Alfie shook his head. That's not any clearer. It's another riddle. He kicked the leg of the table. We're still no closer to the amulets. Melantha had closed her eyes and was whispering under her breath. Keep waiting, she said quietly. It's not over yet. She shook the rattle one more time, and the moon peeped out from the clouds, falling like a spotlight on one of the words, well. The letters jiggled before them, and then Alfie gasped, "It is a riddle. The oracle bones are playing with the words. I am well hidden. Are the amulets hidden inside a well? A well in Tanglefern Forest?" Moll looked blank, but Melantha nodded. "In the heart of the forest." Griff burst into the hovel, his ears flattened to his head. "Urgh!" Moll hurried to the door and peered out. "There's nothing there." Griff began to growl and hiss and stamp. "What is it, Grrr?" Moll started. A blood-curdling howl split her words. A few seconds went by, and then another howl followed, its calls swelling in the marrow of their bones. The hounds were coming for them. Chapter 22, snapping at their heels. "They'll find you if you stay here. They know where I live," Melantha wheezed, hobbling over to the door and bolting it fast. Moll looked down at the bowl and noticed that the bone fragments were now nowhere to be seen. "Put back the crates on the far wall. The slats of wood behind are broken, and you could crawl out through the gorse bushes and trees before the hut. They'll find you until you reach the bottom of the hill." Melantha gripped Moll's hand. "Run, run, like the wind. You're the only person who can stop the madness of the shadow masks." The howls were louder now, slicing the night to slivers. Moll could feel her body shaking as she and Alfie grappled with the wood, tearing it back to reveal a hole. Melantha seized another tiny phial of black liquid from the shelf. "Take this," she stammered, thrusting it into Moll's hands. "You'll need it when they're fighting you, mind. There's still so much you should know." She pointed to the rag she'd given Moll earlier. "But there's no time. Think about the letters, the word. It's all there." Her eyes were half crazed with fear. Go now," she cried, pushing Moll towards the hole. There was a pummeling at the door as the hounds drummed against it with ominous thuds. "But aren't you?" Moll began. Melantha shook her head. "It was written in the oracle bones. I knew when I saw your pa's bone reading in my dreams. I see a place where one day I'll rest from all this pain. The place is on a hill, Molly, only it's bigger, taller, and safer than my own here. And it's not covered in darkness. It's covered in glittering dew. Dew, hill maiden. The oracle bones have come to take me home." "No," Moll cried. We didn't know." Thuds crashed against the hovel door. "It's time, Molly, and I've outlived their curse at least." Melantha smiled sadly. "Hounds, you say? I can bear that pain more than being haunted by a dark magic of the others." Alfie seized Moll's arm and dragged her towards the hole. "Come on!" But it was Griff who finally tore her away, wrenching at her dress with his teeth. They pushed through the hole into the undergrowth, a tangle of Melanthus brambles and overgrown gorse. The sun was rising above the horizon on the sea, and a wind had gathered, rushing across the heath below them like a tormented breath. Above them clouds loomed, swelling across the unsettled sky. Heads down, two children racing through the undergrowth, blind to the gorse bushes tearing at their skin. There was a loud thud behind them, and then the hovel was a frenzy of noise, crashing objects, gnashing teeth, and Melantha's whimpered cries. The wind moaned with Melantha in desolate gusts, but soon her cries were drowned, and once again hounds wailed. Suddenly their cries subsided, and a voice pierced the groaning wind. "A hole at the back!" came Gobbler's unmistakable snarl. As if in response, the hounds growled together, and pounding feet thundered into the undergrowth behind Moll, Griff, and Alfie. "Oh, they're getting closer," Moll cried, her eyes wide with terror. The wind raged on, whipping their hair from their faces and gusting through gorse. At last, the undergrowth and trees pulled back to reveal a ragged track across the heath. Boggy marshes swamped the track, but the three of them charged on through, water spraying their faces. Moll could feel the wind's spirit strength urging them on, away from the hounds. Alfie seized Moll's wrist. "Come on, faster! We can make the forest! We can make it!" The wind grew wilder, catching their heels and whirling them on. They could see the trees now, green giants rearing up before them. Griff pounded on beside Moll, never breaking from her for one instant. Another voice came behind them, calling into the darkness, cold and hollow. "Keep the hounds on her scent, Gobbler." Skull. Moll threw a glance over her shoulder, and what met her eyes chilled her. Some way behind them on the track, 4 huge hounds were craning their necks towards them, their yellow eyes glowing, mouths foaming, and behind them, Skull, Gobbler, and the boys mounted on cobs. Moll turned back and fled on towards the forest. Suddenly, from the shadows of the forest, a line of cobs burst out onto the heath. Moll's eyes widened. Her heart thundered. "Oak!" she screamed. "Oak! Don't cry out!" Alfie panted. Moll screamed again, unable to stop herself. "Oak!" Griff tugged at her dress with his teeth. "No, Moll, no," he seemed to say. The cobs rushed forward. Oak, his sons, and Siddy's father, Jessie. They'd come for her, despite what Skull had made her think, because Oak's camp never leaves a man behind. Moll sped along the path between Griff and Alfie, her heart surging. "Oak!" And then Oak answered, "Keep running." His shout was louder than the wailing wind, and Moll rushed towards it. She turned her head behind them. The hounds edged closer, and yet there was something strange about them. Their necks weren't craned towards her. Their eyes weren't even fixed on her. They were hunting someone else entirely. She glanced towards her side. Alfie. They were hunting Alfie. "Oak!" Moll cried again as the hounds shrieked behind her. "Moll!" Oak roared. His cry lingered in a gust of wind, and from behind them, Skull's terrible laugh, twisting above the pounding hooves of his cob. Moll raced on, blotting out the sounds from behind her as she realised something with sickening dread. Alfie had tried to warn her. Griff had tried to warn her. But still she'd called out, and Oak would have always answered. They'd handed Skull the last piece of the Dreamsnatch. Her name. Moments later, Oak was among them, yanking Moll up from the ground onto the back of his cob and spurring them both away. Moll leant into Oak's body for a second, glimpsed Griff racing along beside them, but when she searched for Alfie, he was nowhere to be seen. She craned her neck back, and there, some metres behind them now, Alfie was cowering among the knotted gorse to the side of the track, his face white, his eyes wide. The hounds were prowling close to him, ears flattened to their heads, saliva hanging from their fangs in drooling chains. Moll watched him, her breath caught in her throat as Oak's cob carried her further and further away. Alfie had given Skull the scrap from her dress, so why had the hounds tracked him? She glanced down at her dress and felt suddenly weak. There was no scrap missing from her frock. It was untorn. She leant into Oak. "We need to go back for Alfie." What was she saying? She didn't need him anymore. She knew where the amulets were, and she had only needed him to escape. What did she feel responsible for him for? Oak hauled his cob to a halt. "Keep going!" roared Wisdom, "or the hounds will attack like before." Only then did Moll notice Wisdom's hand was bandaged up tight and Jessie's ankle was bound. So Skull's hounds had caught them that night. Oak urged his cob further down the track, away from Alfie and the hounds. But Moll started, her lips quivering as she watched a hound scratch back the undergrowth where Alfie crouched, hidden. Gobbler hurried closer and grabbed Alfie by the collar, spitting into his face. Alfie's eyes were fierce, but Moll could see his body trembling. Oak started back towards them, but Skull reached into his robes and drew out a pistol. "Ride!" Oak roared. "Ride!" There was a loud crack. Oak's cob stumbled slightly as blood ran down its piebald leg, and then it galloped on towards the forest, speeding Oak and Moll away with it. And with her stomach churning, Moll kept her head turned and watched Alfie's body disappear as the hounds closed in. Chapter 23. There was a smile behind the mask, and it curdled with pleasure. "Moll." The word rolled around Skull's tongue, then buried itself deep inside his mouth. It was the dead of night, and it was raining heavily. Leafless trees craned over the clearing where Skull and his gang squatted, and lichen trailed from the branches like burnt hair, long, tangled, and grey. The only light came from a lantern set down in the centre of the gang's circle. Rain smeared down Skull's mask. "Moll, Moll, Pecksniff. We've got her good and tight now. We know her name. She won't get away from a Dreamsnatch this time." The mask tilted towards Gobbler. "Polish the ceremonial table. Bring out the drums. It won't be long before she's back here." Gobbler's hunched back swelled with anticipation. "The time has come, hasn't it, Skull? For what we've all been waiting for." Skull's mask dipped. The boys stiffened. "It's time to summon the master of the soul splinter." Skull growled. "Excuse me." One of the boys moved the lantern closer. Brunt shoved him. "You'd better toughen up, all right." Gobbler curled his tongue over his teeth, sucking it in the rain. "This is how the shadow masks kill Moll Pecksniff and her wildcat, after the Dreamsnatch brings them in." He jabbed a sharpened stick into the ground, centimetres from the boy's hand, and then he smiled. "An untraceable kill. What about the amulets? Do they have a chance of finding them in time? Brunt asked. Skull's voice gnawed at the inside of his mask. We need to know why they went to Melantha. Did the traitorous hag know something about the amulets after all? Brunt sat forward. With Melantha dead, can't we ask our little friend Alfie? Gobbler's running eye blinked several times, then he sniggered. The hounds took a liking to him, a strong liking. He's not in a state to talk yet. Skull spat. I told you to hold the hounds back. We need to get the boy to speak. Gobbler lowered his voice. He won't be speaking for some time, Skull. Skull's lifeless eyes blinked once. The lantern the boy was cradling shivered and went out. I don't care what state he's in. Until we have the girl, Alfie's the only one who has the answers we need. Skull replied, but he's a stubborn one with a will of iron. The rain slid down Skull's mask in staking lines. Then beat his cob. Beat it in front of him. That'll get him to speak. All around them the night was as a black abyss filled with the sounds of rain. At the other end of the clearing, set back within the trees, there was a choked whimper. Breath ripped out of Alfie's body, dragging him back into consciousness. Shooting pains burned through his legs, pounding upwards into his body. He tugged against the ropes that bound him to a tree, but they held him fast. Alfie winced. Even his hands, now throbbing at the wrists, had been bound behind his back. What had happened? Melantha, the bone-reading, Moll, and then hounds. They had been pounding through the undergrowth towards them, a terror of teeth and claws. Moll had disappeared. Oak had come for her, and she had escaped and left him for dead. He'd flinched as he straightened himself up. The tree had been tied to his back, grating on his spine. Again, shooting pains coursed through his body. His shorts had been shredded around his knees and his skin torn by cuts and scratches. Grimacing, he rolled his ankle over. 2 rows of teeth marks were gouged into his flesh, rupturing his leg into a mangled wound. A spasm gripped his body and Alfie retched. Fighting back the tears, he bit down on his lip. A gust of wind rustled the dead leaves and tugged his ripped shirt open. Bloodied scratches marred his chest. Still the rain beat on. Alfie wanted to cry out into it, but the pain swallowed his strength. From the trees nearby, Alfie heard Raven whinny, and this time the boy couldn't fight the tears. They fell from his eyes freely until sobs racked his body. Raven stepped forward as far as his tethering rope would allow. He craned his neck towards Alfie, breathing gently through his nostrils. But however far he stretched, he just couldn't reach the boy. And that's when it came to Alfie. A small tatter of hope. He looked at Raven through misted eyes. You're after my rings, he said to the cob in a cracked voice. My rings? Each word wrung his body with pain, but now he had a plan. Though it might take hours, there was a chance he could cut away his way free of the rope with the spikes of his gypsy fighting rings. He looked at the clearing with desperate eyes. Where would they go? And on a night like this? He shook the thought from his mind. That could wait. The most important thing was escaping once and for all. Hours drifted by, and still the boys remained with Skull and Gobbler in the clearing, their voices twisted through the rain to Alfie, strange words loaded with terror. They were planning to summon something. He strained to hear what they were saying. Something about a soul splinter to use on Moll and a wildcat? Alfie stiffened. The word was somehow familiar, as if he'd heard it many years before. He shook his head, though. Turning back to the ropes, facing his past was a task for another night. He needed to focus on getting free. Alfie's rings cut into the rope, bit by bit, a soft scuffing amid the rain-filled night. It isn't working, Raven, Alfie groaned, his voice racked with pain. Just at that moment, when he felt the last of his strength seep away from his body, the rope broke, and Alfie slumped forward. He twisted his neck towards Raven, who neighed softly and pawed at the ground. Shh, boy. Alfie made to get up, but his legs buckled beneath him and he collapsed. Raven turned his back to Alfie. Alfie winced. Don't turn away, boy, he whispered. I'm sorry, it's just I don't have the strength. Raven yanked his neck to the side, and then there was a crack as the tethering rope, which had been fastened from a ground peg to his halter, snapped off. Raven stepped gingerly forward towards Alfie, lowered his neck and nuzzled the boy's head. His warmth surged through Alfie, and he lifted a shaking hand to the cobsman's name. My boy, he whispered. My boy. He sank his head into Raven's mane and watched, his mouth wide in disbelief, as Raven lowered himself to his knees. Alfie shot a look at the clearing, but Skull and his gang were still deep in conversation. Summoning all his strength, Alfie clung to Raven's mane. That's it, boy. That's it. There's a chance now. Flinching in pain with every single movement, Alfie hauled himself up onto Raven's back. His own leg was bloodied and limp, but he felt the power of Raven's legs as the cob thrust his body upwards to a standing position. Alfie was silent for a second. Then he let his head fall down on Raven's mane. I don't know, Alfie. Raven, I don't know where to go. Rain poured down onto Alfie's face, making his teeth chatter. But Raven didn't hang around. He picked his way away from the clearing into the heart of the deep wood. As soon as the camp was out of earshot, Raven quickened his pace, trotting through the deadened glade, then faster, cantering through the crowd of beech trees, until at last they were racing away from Skull through the sodden forest. Alfie clung on. Please don't let me fall, Raven. I can't go back. Don't let me fall. His body slumped on Raven's back and waves of pain washed over him, dragging him back into unconsciousness. Trees around him fell away, and with it the raw aching in his legs. Still, the cob raced on. Alfie's eyes fluttered open as they slowed by the river, but the pain was rolling over him again. And lulled by the pattering of the rain, he felt himself falling away once more into nothingness. He was numb to everything around him. Numb to the splash of water as he fell from Raven into the river, numb even to the strong, firm hands that finally hauled him to the bank. That's where I'm leaving it today. We'll pick it up tomorrow on chapter 24. See you later. Bye.